At precisely 4:17 a.m., the silence of Scotland Yard was broken by a single call. A woman's voice, trembling, breathless, American, cut through the line. "My husband's gone," she whispered. "He just stepped into the dark." She was calling from Whitechapel, the same district where Londoners still speak in hushed tones about Jack the Ripper. Officers rushed to the scene, but the cobblestone alley she described was deserted. Not a sound, not a shadow, just a faint scent of cigarette smoke, and a single, freshly dropped New York taxi medallion glinting under the street lamp. 2 hours later, across the ocean, the NYPD received an unmarked package. Inside, a worn London Underground ticket stub, a tiny silver key, and a note written in thick red ink. "He's not the first. He won't be the last." The return address was more impossible than chilling. A Boston homicide detective who'd been dead for 5 years. Full story. Mark Callahan wasn't the kind of man who vanished. He was predictable, annoyingly so, according to his wife, Emily. Boston-born, a software consultant with a strict daily routine, the kind of person who triple-checks flight itineraries and still arrives at the airport 4 hours early. London was his third trip overseas, and it was supposed to be his easiest. A conference at the Old Truman Brewery, 2 dinners with clients, and 3 days of sightseeing with Emily. On the night of March 14th, they'd spent hours at a quiet wine bar tucked behind Commercial Street. CCTV from that night shows them laughing, leaning close across the table. At 10:46 p.m., they step out into the cold. Emily is wrapped in a beige trench coat. Mark's adjusting the collar of his navy overcoat. They walk hand in hand until Mark's phone buzzes. Emily later told detectives, "He looked at the screen, frowned, and said he needed to take it. He never used that tone with me before." She waits under a street lamp while he steps a few paces away toward the mouth of an alley. The alley, Mitre Court, is barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. Old brick walls, damp from the night air, stretch toward darkness. No shops, no back doors, no fire escapes, just an unbroken passage that ends in shadow. Mark disappears inside. He is never seen walking out. At 10:54 p.m., Emily calls his phone. It rings 3 times, then goes to voicemail. She tries again, and again. By 11:02 p.m., she's inside a nearby kebab shop, begging the cashier to call the police. When Metropolitan Police arrive, they sweep the alley from end to end. The ground is slick with rain, but no footprints, not marks, not anyone's. They check for CCTV, but the only camera facing the alley caught him going in. Then static for 22 seconds. And then nothing. That's when a constable notices something strange, a loose brick, halfway down the wall on the left. Behind it, wrapped in old newspaper, is a New York City taxi medallion, the kind issued in the 1970s. The problem? Mark had never been to New York. By morning, the case is already making its way through both UK and US law enforcement databases. There's no match for the medallion's number in current records. It's been deregistered for decades. But one retired NYPD detective, looking at the case file, sends a single-line email to Scotland Yard. "You found him again." The retired NYPD detective's name was Salvatore Sal Mendez, 72 years old, living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens. When the email from Scotland Yard landed in his inbox, he didn't hesitate. He called immediately. His first words weren't a greeting, they were a warning. "You don't want this case." Sal had worked missing persons in the late 80s and early 90s, a time when New York was bleeding with crime. But there were 6 cases that never fit the statistics. 6 people, all tourists, all from the UK, who vanished within a few blocks of each other in Manhattan. No ransom notes, no bodies, no witnesses, and in every single case, a small, misplaced object turned up, a London Underground ticket, an old British coin, a matchbook from a pub in Camden. Objects that had no connection to the victims, but always to London. Now, hearing about Mark Callahan, Sal saw the mirror image. An American gone missing in London. A clue from New York. Sal's files were yellow with age, the photos curling at the edges. He read the names aloud over the crackling transatlantic line. Rachel Hughes, 1987. Daniel Price, 1989. The youngest, Adam Levy, just 17, vanished in 1993. Emily listened in silence from across the table in the interview room at Scotland Yard. She said it felt like someone was reading her husband's obituary in advance. The detectives began building a timeline. The pattern was unnerving. Each disappearance occurred within 9 days of the anniversary of another. Each victim was last seen within 1 mile of a location tied to an unsolved 1984 murder in Brooklyn, the killing of a British private investigator named Gareth Stone. And each clue left behind seemed to be decades old, as if it had been waiting, hidden, for the right victim. When Yard detectives requested Stone's old case file from the NYPD archives, the courier sent back a box heavier than expected. Inside, mixed with documents and photographs, was a brown leather notebook. The first page read in tight, slanted handwriting, "The cities are closer than they appear." Stone had been investigating a human trafficking network that supposedly operated in both London and New York, using methods so sophisticated that victims could be moved across the ocean without a single trace. No flight manifests, no ferry logs, no passport stamps. It sounded impossible, but the deeper they read, the more the impossible began to feel like fact. The notebook's final entry, dated 3 days before Stone's murder, was only one sentence. "They've found the passage again." Detective Inspector Harriet Cole of Scotland Yard had worked organized crime for 12 years, but she'd never seen a case straddle 2 continents so cleanly. With Sal Mendes now in London, the two compared their maps, his of Manhattan, hers of London. The pins lined up in eerie symmetry. Every location in London had a twin in New York, not just in distance from the city center, but in layout, function, and history. Old shipping docks, decommissioned subway stations, warehouses with sealed basements. It was as if the two cities were reflections of one another, and someone knew exactly how to use that reflection to their advantage. Sal told her about Cortlandt Street Station, demolished in 1970, but with tunnels that still existed in the dark underbelly of Lower Manhattan. Harriet countered with Down Street Station in Mayfair, closed to passengers since the 1930s, but maintained in secret for emergency use. Both, they realized, connected to larger networks that could bypass public eyes entirely. The theory was wild, but Stone's notebook hinted at it repeatedly, something he called the passage. Not a magical doorway, but a chain of hidden routes and complicit hands, allowing the movement of people with absolute invisibility. Then came the break. A forensic tech analyzing the 1970s New York taxi medallion found inside Mitre Court noticed microscopic flecks of marine salt wedged in the engraved numbers, salt mixed with a type of black coal dust long banned in the UK, but still common on a few piers in New Jersey. It meant the object hadn't been stored in London all these years, it had been in New York recently. To test their theory, Cole and Mendez pulled historical freight records. What they found chilled them. Dozens of small, undocumented cargo shipments moving between exactly those twin locations in London and New York. The manifests were vague, the owners masked by shell companies. And then, buried in an old customs ledger from 1994, Harriet found an entry scrawled in pencil where it didn't belong. To souls, priority, no delay. Passage secured. It was dated just 2 days after the disappearance of Adam Levy. The 17-year-old Sal had been haunted by for 3 decades. If the passage was real, it wasn't just about smuggling goods, it was about smuggling people. And whoever controlled it had been doing it without interruption for at least 40 years. They knew the passage wasn't just a theory anymore, but proving it meant catching the people who ran it in the act. And to do that, they needed bait. Emily Callahan didn't hesitate when Harriet Cole laid out the plan. She'd stay in London, in the same hotel she and Mark had shared. She'd walk the same streets, at the same times, retracing his final night step for step. But she wouldn't be alone. Every alley, every rooftop, every shadow would be watched by an undercover team, half from Scotland Yard, half flown in by the FBI. If the passage had eyes on her, they'd see the window was open again. The operation began at 9 p.m. sharp. Emily wore a wire, the same beige trench coat from that night, and a scarf to conceal the tiny camera sewn into her lapel. Her voice was steady, but her pulse, visible on the monitor, told a different story. By 10:43 p.m., she reached the wine bar. Harriet and Sal monitored from an unmarked van nearby, their screens flickering with infrared feeds from hidden cameras. Emily stepped outside at 10:46, just like before. This time, the call came sooner. A phone, buried in the pocket of her coat, buzzed with a number that didn't exist. Emily answered. A male voice, calm, polite, British, spoke for words. Turn right. Walk slowly. Every team in the area moved into position. Emily turned. The voice guided her down a narrow lane, one not even marked on the maps. Halfway down, the street lamps flickered, then died. The wire went silent. The lapel camera showed nothing but black. Harriet's radio erupted with overlapping shouts from her team. No one could see Emily anymore. Then, as suddenly as it began, the lamps flared back to life. The lane was empty. Emily was gone. In the space where she'd stood, the only trace was a single playing card, the Queen of Hearts, damp from the night air. Sal picked it up, turning it over. On the back, in the same slanted handwriting from Stone's notebook, was a single sentence. This one's personal. The trap had worked, but not in the way they expected. The hunters had just been outplayed. Harriet slammed the van door shut, the Queen of Hearts card still burning in her palm. She didn't wait for authorization. Scotland Yard had rules, but rules didn't save lives, and Emily's was on the line. "Sal," she said, voice low, urgent. "We're going in. Tonight." The streets of Whitechapel were quiet, but the silence was heavier than any crowd. Every step echoed off brick walls, every shadow seemed alive. Harriet led, Sal closed behind, their breath forming small clouds in the icy London night. The trail led to an abandoned warehouse near the Thames. Rusted chains clinked against broken windows. The faint hum of a generator suggested someone had been waiting. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke. And then they saw her, Emily, tied to a chair, gagged, a single lamp casting long shadows over her face. But she wasn't alone. Standing just behind her was a man in a tailored suit, calm, collected, and unmistakably the one who'd orchestrated the passage. Harriet's heart hammered. This was no ordinary criminal. This was a mastermind, one who had eluded Scotland Yard and the FBI for years. "Who are you?" Harriet demanded, her gun shaking slightly in her hands. The man smiled. "I've been waiting for you. You all think you're clever, but you've been dancing in my game from the start." Suddenly, another figure emerged from the shadows, someone Harriet had never expected. Mark, Emily's missing brother. His face was pale, eyes hollow, but there was recognition there. "You didn't think I'd let her go that easily," he whispered. Sal stepped forward, gun raised. Harriet froze, realizing the impossible. The people she thought she knew were part of a game darker than she ever imagined. A tense standoff erupted. One wrong move, one flick of a finger, and Emily's life would end. But Harriet, trained in negotiation, slowly advanced, speaking calmly, weaving a story that both Mark and the mastermind couldn't ignore. Minutes stretched into eternity. The lights flickered, a shadow danced across the walls, and then, in a heartbeat, Mark's resolve wavered. He released Emily. The mastermind lunged. A shot rang out. The sound echoed off the warehouse walls. Harriet's training saved her. The criminal lay immobilized, captured at last. Emily ran into Harriet's arms. Sal cuffed Mark, still in shock, muttering fragments of apologies. Outside, the night seemed impossibly still again. The Thames reflected the first faint light of dawn. The streets of Whitechapel were quiet, but Harriet knew the darkness wasn't gone. It had only retreated, waiting, as always, for the next shadow to emerge. The case was closed, but the scars remained. And as the van pulled away, Emily whispered, "I don't think I'll ever feel safe again." Harriet didn't answer. Some darkness, she knew, never truly left. Fade to black. If you felt the tension and chills of this story, don't forget to comment your thoughts, subscribe for more gripping true crime tales, and hit the bell so you never miss a mystery unraveling.